spiketi.
Welcome to this presentation, Poetry of Seamus, Heaney and Owen with a comparison of 4 poems and a focus on their language, form and structure. Firstly, I will look at a brief background of both poets, then 2 sets of poetry analysis of 4 poems, and an overall comparison of those 4 poems, and a conclusion and final thoughts. So here is a little bit about Seamus Heaney, who lived to be just over 70 years old. He was an Irish poet, Nobel laureate, playwright, lecturer, translator, and professor of poetry at both Harvard and Oxford. Came from a Catholic family in Northern Ireland and grew up on a farm of about 50 acres. His inaugural first collection was Death of a Naturalist, published in 1966, comprised 34 poems, mainly dealt with changing identity, family relationships, and rural life. And a formidable, well-loved reputation, the greatest poet of our age, according to Professor John Sutherland, and the most important Irish poet since Yeats, according to the American poet Robert Lowell. So on to Owen Shears with a brief bit of background. Born in Fiji, but grew up mainly in southeast Wales, near the Black Mountains. Nature a big influence on his life. His grandfather was a maths teacher and a sheep farmer, and he is keen on Welsh culture and its language. He's a Welsh poet, author, playwright, TV presenter, and professor of creativity at Swans University, and a good rugby player. He played for Gwent County at scrum half. Skirrid Hill was Owen's second collection of poetry and comes from the Welsh, which means divorce or separation. He won the 2006 Somerset Maugham Award for that collection. It comprises 42 short poems which cover a range of themes, including separation, relationships, and connection to place. In a conversation with The Independent, Shears said that Heaney's poem Midterm Break was one of the first poems that gripped him, so he has an admiration for Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet. So, on to the first poem, and I will read it before we do any analysis. All year the flax dam festered in the heart of the townland. Green and heavy-headed flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. Daily it sweltered in the punishing sun. Bubbles gargled delicately. Blue bottles wove a strong gauze of sound around the smell. There were dragonflies, spotted butterflies, but best of all was the warm, thick slobber of frog spawn that grew like clotted water in the shade of the banks. Here, every spring, I would fill jam potfuls of the jellied specks to range on windowsills at home, on shelves at school, and wait and watch until the fattening dots burst into nimble swimming tadpoles. Miss Walls would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was frog spawn. You could tell the weather by the frogs too, for they were yellow in the sun and brown in the rain. Then, one hot day when the fields were rank with cow dung in the grass, the angry frogs invaded the flax dam. I ducked through hedges to a coarse croaking that I had not heard before. The air was thick with a bass chorus. Right down the dam, gross-bellied frogs were cocked on sods. Their loose necks pulsed like sails. Some hopped. The slap and plop were obscene threats. Some sat poised like mud grenades, their blunt heads farting. I sickened, turned, and ran. The great slime kings were gathered there for vengeance, and I knew that if I dipped my hand, the spawn would clutch it. So the first thing I want to explain in this poem is what we mean by flax dam. So flax is a kind of plant which is used to make linen, and particularly in Ireland, Irish linen. And it involves a process called retting. You can see that in the third line where it says the flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. This is to do with the process in which the flax is put under water for 14 days in the retting flax dam, or lint hole as it's otherwise known, and involves a chemical reaction which slightly weakens the bonds holding the fibre together, and the woody stem is loosened. Next, we'll just mention what this poem is generally about. So on the left-hand side, we can see lots of happy language. The title of the poem is Death of a Naturalist. So we start with this idea perhaps of loving nature, of it being wonderful and just one-sided goodness. But then we have also this concept of death. So on the right-hand side with the dark highlighted blue color, we can see all this negative language, and we'll look at that in a minute, and how it's kind of a changing perception there's a two-sided narrative to this poem. And we'll just pick out one or two of these images so that we don't talk too long. But on the left-hand side, we can see bubbles gargle delicately. So these are happy images. There's an interesting word here called gauze, which is a type of light, soft cloth, which could be used in a surgical dressing, or it can also mean a fine mist or haze. So that is a little bit connected to the idea of linen creation with the flax dam. So this positive idea, creation. Best of all was the warm, thick slobber. It's a nice image. Best of all. Clotted water sounds almost like clotted cream, something nice. Jam potfuls, this is happy. Fattening dots burst, a happy image as well. And Miss Walls would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, mammy frog. This is childlike language, positive and innocent with youth. Then, with this volta, then, in the blue side, near the top, in the second stanza, we see a change. So all of the language there, if not all, most of it, is more negative. Rank, smelling, angry, personification of the frogs. Coarse croaking, something unpleasant. Had not heard before, so there's a change. Air thick with a bass chorus, so it's almost like a war. Gross-bellied frogs were cocked, again, cocking of a gun. Loose necks, pulse like sails. Dystopian Junkie, another YouTuber, mentions that this could be like warships approaching. Slap and plops were obscene threats, obscene, something unpleasant and unwanted. Poised like mud grenades, again with the war metaphor. Blunt heads farting, not nice. And the great slimekins, more personification, showing power and him feeling threatened, the speaker feeling threatened by the frogs who he felt were gathered for vengeance because he had collected their frog spawn before. So he's creating the speaker is creating an interesting narrative and imagining that nature is coming to get him. There's lots of onomatopoeia in this poem, lots of words related to sound and synthesia, the mixing of senses. And the poem is in blank verse, which means it is not rhymed, but it is using iambic pentameter. So the emphasis is a rising tones from unstressed to stressed, and it tends to have similar line lengths of 10 syllables. If you count on your finger all year, the flax dam festered in the heart, there's about 10 syllables in that line. And that is the first poem. This is the second poem, Winter Swans by Owen. And like before, first I'll do a reading of the poem and then we'll do a brief analysis. Here we go with the reading. The clouds had given their all, 2 days of rain and then a break, in which we walked. The waterlogged earth, gulping for breath at our feet as we skirted the lake, silent and apart, until the swans came and stopped us with a show of tipping in unison, as if rolling weights down their bodies to their heads. They halved themselves in the dark water, icebergs of white feather, paused before returning again, like boats righting in rough weather. They mate for life, you said, as they left, porcelain over the stilling water. I didn't reply, but as we moved on through the afternoon light, slow stepping in the lake's shingle and sand, I noticed our hands that had somehow swum the distance between us, and folded one over the other like a pair of wings settling after flight. So, a little bit similar to Death of a Naturalist, the theme is change in essence. Rather than being about an individual in Death of a Naturalist, this is a partnership, this is a couple. And in the first two stanzas, we can see that perhaps they've had an argument and there's a change, a kind of a reconciliation and the couple coming together again. So this is showing conflict and love, a relationship on the rocks in the sense that it's not ready and then it slowly starts to come back together again. And just as before, we'll look at the imagery and language and how Shears shows the change in the relationship. So the first two stanzas you can see are highlighted in blue. The language is more negative. Clouds had been raining, clouds had given their all, 2 days of rain. And the earth is waterlogged, almost as if the earth is drowning. Their relationship, in essence, is also underwater and in difficulty. It's kind of a pathetic fallacy, the emotion of the couple reflected in nature. and we have that interesting image of the couple skirting the lake, silent and apart, literally skirting the lake, going around the lake, but also figuratively their relationship, avoiding difficult issues perhaps. And then we have a volta in stanza 3, until the swans came. So the arrival of the swans seems to signal a change in the relationship. The swans are tipping in unison, as can be seen in the background picture, and this image of weights rolling down their bodies to their heads. It's like water off a duck's back, that expression, that they're losing the chip on the shoulder. In essence, it's coming off, the weight is coming off, emphasizing the relationship is starting to change. They have themselves in the dark water, stanza 4. Still a little bit negative, the dark water, but it seems like the problem is being reduced somehow. Pause before returning again, like boats righting in rough weather. So with this simile, like boats righting, you can see the swans are able to return to a stability. And this is literal again, that swans are able to do that. It's one of their natural abilities. But it's also figurative in the sense that the relationship seems to be returning to a kind of stability, though it's gone through a stormy patch. And in the final 3 stanzas, it begins with another kind of volta, in a sense, the direct speech, they mate for life. And this is kind of one of the individuals in the relationship trying to instigate change, giving the naturalist fact, in essence, that swans do apparently stay together for life, and suggesting that they could do the same, the couple. And the other individual says, I didn't reply, so they're still a little bit unsure. But the relationship starts to come back. Slow stepping in the lake shingle. This stanza has a lot of what's called sibilance, the soft S sound, a kind of consonance. There's lots of examples there, and it seems to smooth it. It's as if the poetry is whispering in the ear, trying to create a positive change. And then the final, and we have this imagery of the swum the distance. The hands are moving together, and they're using the imagery of the swan's movement inside the couple's relationship again. And finally, the wing settling, showing that their relationship is again protected and they're protecting each other. And there is a little bit of enjambment in this poem, which comes from French, to run on. So there are many instances when there's no end stop to a line. For example, in the first stanza, after break, it goes straight away to the next word in, and later on as well. In later stanzas, when the relationship is coming back together, I didn't reply, it goes straight to the next line, but. And I think this is helping to keep the flow of the poem, much like water flows, and water is a big connecting thread which goes through this. It's unrhymed, so in Owen Shear's poetry, he uses a lot of free verse, where he doesn't use rhyme. I think this is a modernist style, which is quite popular. And as I said, there's plenty of sibilance, that's the consonants which goes through the poem. I also mentioned that the structure of Winter Swans is interesting and a little bit more elaborate than Death of a Naturalist, which was only 2 stanzas. Winter Swans, as you can see, is 7 stanzas, and all of them except for the last stanza are triplets, lines of 3. The last stanza is a couplet, just 2 lines together. And you can see that for the majority of the poem, we're not sure if this couple is apart or together. So in a sense, Owen Shears has put it as 3 to indicate or suggest that unknown. And only finally at the end, once their hands have swum the distance, do we see that the structure changes from a triplet to a couplet, and the couplet itself a symbol of the couple being one again. A mini comparison of those 2 poems, Death of a Naturalist, indicated by DN, and Winter Swans, indicated by WS. Both poems allude to changing relationships. Death of a Naturalist shows a relationship between the speaker and nature, and a change as the speaker matures, whereas Winter Swans shows a relationship between a couple and the effect of nature. There is conflict in both poems, and you can see that the direction may be different. Death of a Naturalist is showing an increasing conflict, and we're not sure whether there's resolution, whereas Winter Swans is going in the opposite direction, from conflict towards resolution. Both poems use nature to signal a volta, a turn. However, Winter Swans uses direct speech to show that one partner affects the other. Both poems use ambiguous language, for example, gauze, as we mentioned before, and skirted in Winter Swans. Death of Naturalist, the language changes from the first to the second stanza, and there is heavy use of onomatopoeia, whereas in Winter Swans, onomatopoeia is less frequent with a perhaps more mature tone. Both poems are unrhymed. Death of Naturalist uses blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter, whereas Winter Swans uses free verse, irregular line length with no clear rhyme scheme. There is lots of personification and some pathetic fallacy perhaps in both poems. So that is the end of part 1. Thanks for watching. Please click on the link below to see the next 2 poems.